In Pakistan, the previous coalition government led by Shehbaz Sharif left behind a substantial fiscal deficit of 7.7% of GDP at the close of the fiscal year 2022-23. This number contradicts their claim of a 7% deficit. Similarly, the primary deficit stands at 690 billion rupees or 0.8% of GDP, not the government's claimed 0.5%. Both provincial and federal governments contributed to this fiscal shortfall, with provinces not fulfilling commitments and the central government's estimate falling short, leading to a gap of 689 billion rupees. In contrast, the fiscal deficit during PTI's final year in power was slightly higher at 7.9% of GDP, with a primary deficit of 3.1% of GDP. This marked a substantial 83% surge in debt servicing costs within a year. Defense spending increased by 12% but remained proportionally lower at 1.9% of GDP in fiscal year 23 compared to 2.1% in fiscal year 22 due to inflation's impact. The revenue to GDP ratio declined from 12% in fiscal year 2022 to 11.4% in fiscal year 2023. Tax revenue also decreased from 10.1% during PTI's tenure to 9.2% of GDP under the coalition government. However, non-tax revenue improved from 1.9% to 2.1%, mainly due to increased petroleum levy. Total revenue saw a 20% rise, reaching 9.634 trillion rupees in fiscal year 23. Compared to 8.035 trillion rupees in the previous year. Total tax revenue grew by 16% to 7.82 trillion rupees. Federal tax revenue rose by 17% to 7.169 trillion rupees, while provincial revenue increased by 6% to 650 billion rupees, lagging behind the 29% inflation rate. Meanwhile, total expenditure surged by 22% to 16.155 trillion rupees in fiscal year 2023, with current spending rising by 27% to 14.58 trillion rupees. Direct taxes increased their share to 3.9% of GDP in 2022-23, up from 3.4% in fiscal year 2022. To cover the fiscal deficit, the government heavily relied on domestic borrowing of 7.2 trillion rupees by 30th June 2023. Additionally, around 680 billion rupees of external debt was retired due to the IMF program suspension, impacting foreign borrowing.